Well, good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to see all of you here this evening. My name is Norman Goda. I am the director for the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida, and we have a wonderful and a very timely event tonight, a conversation between Yossi Turner and Roy Holler on where is Israel headed. I can't imagine anything more timely than this. I will introduce our introducer, but before this, I want to thank the people who are making this evening possible. I would like to thank the staff at B'nai Israel Congregation, Rabbi Kamen, Jennifer Petrescu. I'd like to offer my thanks to Philip Schwartz as well, who is making it possible for us to broadcast this event and to record it. I'm not always great at communicating with Phil, but I want to apologize for that and thank Phil for his efforts. And finally, I would like to thank Audrey Adams and John Morris. They contacted us at the center a while back and said they wanted to be involved and that they were very interested in current Israeli politics. And so we thought about putting together this event, and it's through their support and generosity that we have been able to do so, and I wanted to thank them personally. I am going to introduce my colleague Rachel Gordon. Rachel Gordon is the Samuel Bud Shorstein Professor of American Jewish Culture and Society, and many of you know Rachel already. Rachel will sort of act as MC of sorts tonight, but she will introduce our speakers, and I will turn things over to her.
Thank you. Just want to echo Norm's thank you to all for being here, and also to Audrey and John. This event came about in the best way possible. We had an event at the end of January about anti-Semitism that our good friend Buddy Shorstein sponsored, and John and Audrey were there and really appreciated this kind of event and came up to me at the end and voiced their support, and Audrey really said, I'd like to help make these kinds of things possible, and it's wonderful when we have people in the community who take that kind of initiative. So thank you all for coming out tonight for this. I'm so glad to introduce my colleagues. Roy Holler is an assistant professor of Israel Studies at UF, and Professor Yossi Turner is professor of Jewish philosophy and thought, who's visiting with us this year. So after this conversation, I think we will open it up to audience questions and comments, and then we'll have a chance to hear from folks here, but we'll start with you two.
Thank you, everybody, for showing up here tonight. I'm thrilled for this conversation. I was born and raised in Israel. My entire family is there, my friends, and I've been following those all the events that we see on television, and it was really frustrating for not being able to participate in some way or the other in what's going on around the judicial reform. I really think whatever side of the political map you might find yourself, the truth is that the democracy of the only democratic country in the Middle East is being tested right now. And since we cannot all go and demonstrate in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem for or against this proposed change to the judicial system in Israel, I do think it's very important that we can talk about it here in this space. And thank you very much, Yossi, for for agreeing to have this very important conversation right now. So I'm really looking forward to hear your thoughts and hear your questions that will follow this discussion. I think I have many questions for Professor Turner. I think before discussing maybe the meaning and the implication of the judicial reform, what is going on in Israel right now?
That's a very broad question, and it's good that it's a broad question because giving focus to the specific matter of what the government is calling judicial reform and the opposition is calling revolution in Israel's system of government, in order to understand not only the different positions coming from right and left, but actually what's at stake here, it requires a very broad question. The focus at the moment is the judicial reform, which I imagine we'll talk about a little bit later. But what has, let's say, instigated or aroused the incredible protests and demonstrations, we're talking about between 100,000 and 200,000 people in the streets in a small country like Israel every week. And what's around, and you would say, very not statistically, but that half the country is demonstrating in the streets. That's how much what's going on disturbs them. And in order to understand why this half finds it so disturbing, and why the other half, or the government and its supporters, were willing or actually maneuvered the country into a situation in which the polarization and the dichotomy is so large. In order to answer that question, we need to go indeed through beyond the question of the judicial reform. And so I'll start with that. So the first thing I think is important to note, just as kind of like a snapshot of the present, actually the second thing, the first thing that I have to say is that at this point, nobody really knows what's going to happen, and most of what I'm going to have to say is going to be based on the process, what's been happening over a number of months, where the present situation, without getting into it now, that we'll also get into, there's a hiatus where the government has stopped its legislation, and there's a kind of a negotiation going on at the president's house. Nobody knows what's going to come from that. So not everything that I'm going to say is necessarily so after the present situation. And I guess we'll talk about what other alternatives come up. But in terms of the situation that we've seen in the news up until, I don't know, I'm just throwing out 2 weeks ago. I don't remember when this hiatus actually started. But what we're seeing is actually a battle between two distinct sectors in Israeli society over the future of the country. It needs to be taken into account that we're now following a situation that over a number of years, if I remember correctly, I forget already if it was 4 or 5 elections, that a stalemate was produced. And so Israel has not had an elected government for a number of years now. And the government at present is, it can actually be described as a very right-wing government with aspects of the government, or parts of the government being really surprising. People thought that people in Israel never believed would wind up in the government in Israel. And also that it's a government that, compared to recent Israeli history, has a clear majority because the government was elected. If you don't get more than half of the votes, to form a coalition, you're not going to have a government. So, but nonetheless, this government has a majority of all of 4 votes in the parliament out of 120. So it's 64 out of 120. It's a clear majority, but it's still not that far from what we're talking about. To go beyond this slightly, it's important to think for a moment demographically. Who comprises these two camps that are now battling over Israel's identity? And I think that you can put it this way. The present government, it's dropping in the polls, but nonetheless, we can say that the present government is largely supported by ultra-Orthodox society, which we have to say never took a really big interest in Israeli democracy as a matter of principle. It's also a large part of the government, a large part, we're talking about two parties that joined, are from the extreme right national religious parties. One's called the National Religious Party. One of them is, we can call it a slightly tamer heritage of the Kahana movement. I mean, these are the parts of the government that nobody ever expected would be in the government. And a third component, which is really important, and ultimately it's what makes the balance in the government, is the group of, it's hard to, and nothing's foolproof here, but we're talking about, let's say, Mizrahi Jews, right? Let's say people in my wife's family, came from Yemen. Nothing here is absolute. I mean, everybody, in each group, there are those who think differently. But demographically, that's the government. And when you think about it, you can also understand why it is that there's a common denominator between the different components of the government that I mentioned at the moment. And it has to do with the emphasis on Jewish identity and the concept of Israel as a Jewish state, in the way that people who are traditional, maybe Orthodox, and I include myself in this group, not as Orthodox, but as traditional and somebody who sees his whole life as being involved in Judaism and Jewish sources, even though I'm not with the government politically. You could see why these groups, Orthodox, national religious, and Mizrahi traditional Jews, have a common denominator where the opposition, again, largely, not entirely, is comprised of Jewish communities and families and individuals who come from a more secular background, a slightly traditional to not traditional at all, and people who, how would I put it? Peoples whose first commitment is that to universal humanist values. To give a bottom line to your question, I would put it like this. I think we're talking about a battle between two parts of Israeli society over the identity of the state, whereas at one time, already at the beginning of Zionism, later on in Israel's Declaration of Independence, and the first 30 years or so at least of Israel as a state, there was a unifying tension in all of these, Zionism, the state of Israel, a unifying tension between Jewish particularism, Jewish needs, warding off anti-Semitism, Jewish culture, but Jewish particularism on the one hand, and universal human values on the other. And it was a unifying tension. Now it seems, and this is a process that has probably gone over about 3 decades or 4 decades now, that it seems that two different camps have come about, where one camp identifies almost totally, that would be what's considered wrongly the left in Israel, as I believe mostly committed to the universal human values, and took that part of what was once the unifying tension, and the other camp identifies almost totally with the matter of the Jewish character of the state. So it was once unifying, has now been torn apart, and the two parts are fighting each other. Right. And I see very generally that's what we've been seeing in the last few.
So let me ask. This process that you're discussing is indeed years in the making, but there seemed to be a certain status quo throughout, right? Throughout the years. I'm just wondering what went wrong. Even politically speaking, I would say that the Orthodox and the religious Zionists did manage to get what they needed from the government, right, from the state, mostly I would say on the backs of the secular society. So what exactly is that made that rift that we see today?
That's a good question, and so I think it's already understood that the really solid, out and out, some people think total or almost total rift between the camps in Israel. So it's obviously this has been something that's been developing for a long time. What happened now? So that we can all discuss that and have different opinions. and I've been trying to figure this out, and I would say two things. One is long term. I think that there's something happening in Israel that's similar to things that are happening in the United States, where what was once the center of the country no longer exists. And in politics, everybody's drawn to the extremes, and people fight over symbols, and people vote according to symbols that express their identity. I think you know what? This is to the one point, right? If we realize that both the United States and Israel, and I would say in much of the West, over the past few decades, digital technology works in electioneering and politics the same way it does in commerce and marketing, we can see in the long term how all over the West, and this is part of what's going on in Israel, is that people have gotten used to thinking that they vote and need for the country to be a reflection of their own personal identity. And this has happened in every one of the elections that I mentioned earlier, where there was a stalemate, right? I mean, the reason there was a stalemate and nobody won, I think, is because almost everybody has been drawn to vote for the phrases, the slogans, the images that reflect who they are in respect to Israel, right? So that's already a dichotomizing thing. In order to win an election, even that's important for your values, you have to go to the most extreme position because that's where the coalition is made. So that's one thing. I think it's a product of technology and the way politics has become a product of marketing. The other thing that's happened here, and this also I think is similar to the States, but after not having a government for a number of years, except for caretaker governments, and what can we say? It's very important to know that during this time, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who really put together the right-wing coalition that's now represented in the government, and much of which was represented in earlier Netanyahu governments, during this period of time, he's been brought up on charges of corruption, and he's on trial. So again, we can argue and debate to what extent is Netanyahu's legal difficulties prompted him. I think that what's happened here has to do also a lot with Netanyahu's personality and his genius in terms of communications and the public impressions and in an extent getting the votes out and winning elections. What is Netanyahu's genius? I think, and look, anybody can argue with me, but I've been following this. Netanyahu is brilliant at juggling. And he waits the longest time he can to make decisions because he seems to me to always have two things that he's looking for. One, as long as it's possible, he's looking for the good of the country. And he's very talented and very capable. My take of the Prime Minister at the moment is that he's still more interested in himself. And if it comes to a conflict between what's good for the country and what he needs to survive or even thrive politically, he's going to use his genius at media manipulation in order to make those identity symbols that I mentioned earlier even stronger. After we haven't had a government like this, and all through these years, in order to maintain his support for the next election, because the last election didn't bring a win, he's been driving home more and more statements and policies that divide the identities of the Jews in Israel. And I think that these two have come together, and now we have a situation in which the government has, let's say, a sense of self, or put it better, the coalition that supports the government in society has a sense of self it never had before. It's almost like going back to 1977, when there was first time a right-wing government elected in Israel, and a feeling that was existent then, I think, is even on the right, even more existent now and more powerful. The idea that the country was set up by secular Ashkenazi Jews from the West who are not very traditional, not very observant, not what we mean when we talk about the Jewish people. And now, I think, in coincidence with with Netanyahu's political strategy. So there are now people coming around and saying, enough of that. The job of the government is to rule. And to rule means to put through our policies, not their policies. And I think that that's pretty much what's happened now. And because that position has become so one-sided, the opposition feels like everything it believes in and everything it's interested in Israel is just being given up. The right has had times to feel that way too, by the way. This is the first time, though, that it's a constitutional issue that's dividing the country, the very constitutional basis of the country's existence.
Right. I think one of the headlines that that came up today, so Yom HaZikaron, the Memorial Day, is coming up, and it seems like for the first time, the Orthodox representatives of the government, the Orthodox ministers, are not welcome in those ceremonies. They will not attend. So you talked about, right, the Jewish particularism and human. So and we did mention the status quo. Now it's broken. Nobody really seems to be happy. The change in the legal system is it's on hiatus. But even when it comes back, it's not like it's going to pass in a second. So what is it? So what is it then about? Do we see what you mentioned, the idea of going towards a more Jewish particular state is represented in that judicial change, right, in the sort of proposed changes to the non-existent constitution, the basic laws, right? So do we see that struggle between kind of old-fashioned Zionism, humanism to Jewish particularism in the proposed changes?
Yeah. And this is very important. The first point that I may ask you in a moment to remind me of this, the latter parts of the question. But the first thing you mentioned, first of all, reflects how deep the division is in the country. This has never happened before, that politicians were asked not to come to the military cemeteries on Remembrance Day. The reason it's come up now is, and this also shows that it's not just the judicial system, there has been, over the years, as you probably know, incredible debate what to do with Orthodox yeshiva students concerning the universal draft. It's not really a universal draft in Israel, but the draft that supposedly obligates, it's a matter of inequality from the point of view of the left, of the Democrats, of the humanists. How can we send our children to fight? And they don't have to, right? So during the years, there were a number of proposals to solve them, but every time there was a coalition with an ultra-Orthodox, that depended on ultra-Orthodox support, the solutions that brought about were taken down, that were never implemented. What's happened now is that I'm saying, it's my commentary, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, in order to satisfy the ultra-Orthodox contingent of the government now, it's not only laws concerning the judicial system in Israel. One law that's actually making headway and doesn't have a hiatus about is a law that would effectively excuse all yeshiva students from draft into the army from the age of 23 on, and until the age of 23, they just have to keep staying in the yeshiva. The fact that it came at a time where the opposition feels as though the government is staging a revolution against them just adds, like gasoline to the fire. And the reason that people have come up now is, number one, and said we don't want these people visiting the military cemeteries on Memorial Day in Israel. Of course, it has to do with that people are fearful that it also sparked debates and protests, and nobody wants that on Memorial Day. But it is going along with that people who lost their children and their relatives in wars in the current situation don't want to be preached to by people who, out of principle, don't send their children to the army and and are pushing through the bill to save their children from having to go to the army. And just to be fair, I'll say that there are certain points that are made. They think that there's something very special about Torah learning. I, by the way, also think there's something very special about Torah learning. I just don't see the difference between the yeshiva and the university, for that matter. And if you go by that, then nobody's going to have to go to the army. But I think that's what it is. It's those two things.
So I think the second part of my question was then the judicial reform. So
Right.
what changes are being proposed and why is the significant pushback against it? And then how would this reform affect
Right,
the legal
right,
system in Israel?
right.
And I have a million questions.
I got
but,
so again, I'll remember as much as I can, and you'll remind me afterwards. The judicial reform. Okay, so what are the things that have been proposed? And most of the things that I'm going to mention have already made it through the first and some even the second vote in preparation for legislation. It's only from the third vote in the parliament that the legislation actually goes through. And this is where everything stopped for the time being. Basically, what we have here is an attempt on the part of the government. I would say, the government denies it, but I don't see any way of seeing it differently, doing away with the independence of the courts. There is a problem in Israel. I am not one of those, even though I consider myself part of the opposition at the moment, I'm not one of those who would like the judicial laws, the judicial system in Israel to remain exactly as it is. There have been complaints against it. Things that earlier on I couldn't really understand because I'm too much, sometimes I think too abstractly. I didn't understand in the past the request or the demand of many people in society to try to figure out a system in which the judges actually represent different parts of the community. In adjudicating, that would be terrible. But when you think about people come from different areas, have different sensitivities and different and their personalities enter in, I'm actually for that kind of change. But the way in which and that's been one of the gripes against the judicial system through the years. Another gripe of the judicial system, which I've never identified with, is that too often, the court makes decisions in line with universal human values, and as has been stated, I don't know if it's true or not, I don't tend to think so, negating the universal human value, negating the Jewish values in order. So where would this come up? Just two examples, right? Israel had a very, very large labor migration, because Israel's the most attractive country economically and, to get a job in the Mideast. So refugees and people who are migrating to look for work were drawn to Israel. And then the right believed, and I think correctly so to a certain extent, that if it continues, Israel won't be able to continue to be a Jewish state. And so there's been, but then there's the matter of what do you do with these people? A lot of them are refugees. A lot of these people came from the Sudan. So a couple of years ago, people thought the situation was getting better. Nobody would think of sending people to the Sudan. What are you going? The government thought of, well, we can encourage them to leave. We'll kind of like put them into some kind of forced housing so they won't want to stay. And stuff like that. But the idea was that a lot of people thought that the court was acting against the interests of Israel as a Jewish state, right? And the same thing sometimes, very often there's a conflict between security needs, and worldwide. There are things that you are allowed to and even obligated to do that causes harm to other people, that in other situations where there is no security challenge, you're just not allowed to do. So there's a real dilemma here, and the court has to decide. One part of the country thinks that the court, and it's not true in my opinion, but always decides for universal human values and not for Jewish and Israeli interests. This is a political problem. That's not a judicial problem. What are the things that have been suggested? A law that revamps the committee to choose the judges. At present, the judges are chosen by a committee that has representatives of the court. The Supreme Court chooses representatives for this committee. The Israeli bar chooses representatives, and then there are also political representatives, political parties. And it's worked out so nobody, particularly the political parties, don't have a clear majority. There's no automatic majority. The government is changing that, so the ruling coalition wants to change it, will necessarily have a majority, obvious that impinges on the independence of the courts. There's the question of judicial review, and this is the fundamental thing that we ought to be aware of. Israel doesn't have a constitution. I think it's a terrible thing for a country like Israel not to have a constitution. But still, what happens? Governments will always make decisions in their interest, in their political interest, and always. And I don't care. I don't criticize governments for that. But that's why they need an independent court. To make sure, right, if the government decides that this is a security issue, the court very often can say, in terms of the balance, the government has the prerogative, and more often than not says the government has the prerogative for the security issue. But there are times that the court steps in. For instance, I mentioned before, having to do with the migrant workers, that mostly settled in the area of South Tel Aviv, which hurts. I mean, it is a lot of crime, there are a lot of problems, and really hurts the people, right. Okay, so they want to set up a system where the coalition will be able to do what it wants, both in terms of its responsibility for the country and in terms of its indebtedness to its power base, and wants to shut off, change the committee so there won't be a possibility of a majority in that committee other than that of the coalition. Another government, still talking about judicial review, another law that the government wanted to pass and started, I'm reading in the papers now that they think, and I'm very happy about this, they probably acknowledge that it's not going to go through, is that the Knesset, the parliament, should be able to negate a decision made by the court through judicial review, even on a majority of one vote in the parliament, which again would mean that at the government's whim, because the government always controls the majority in the parliament, at the government's whim, it can overturn a Supreme Court decision, right? Independence of the court. There are a number of other laws. I don't think it's necessary to go into all of them. I think these are the primary ones that really got the opposition going, and I think for good reason. As far as what it means, so I'm saying, once again, I talked about the unifying tension of universal humanist values and Jewish particularism. So this means, this is say, an expression of the breaking of that tension, right? Two camps, one is for the courts and one is against the courts, right? But it also means, especially in a country that you don't have a constitution, but even if you're in a country where you do have a constitution, if you don't have courts to uphold the constitution, there's nothing to protect foreigners, there's nothing to protect people who are exercising their basic freedoms and just trying to live. If the government or the majority thinks that they're disturbing the country, you can never create a situation where the courts will say, no, here you've crossed the line. Because it means the intended legislation is meant to make the courts subservient to the government. And so all the things that we think that are necessary in a democracy, in a modern civil society that's a democratic society, human rights, equality before the law, protection against governmental, I don't even know what the word would be, if the government uses its power to come after you, if you don't have an independent court, there are no protections like that. And this, of course, has to do with minorities and other religions, everything you can think of.
So you mentioned really the refugees. So let's say a revised court who is more in mediation between universal values and Jewish particularism manages to find a middle-of-the-road solution in terms of keeping the nature of Israel as a Jewish state. But then that's the big question, I think, behind it. What happens when we talk about other civil rights and other minority rights who are Jews, for example, LGBTQ communities, right? How would sort of a restructured court that works in between the two worlds can maintain, right, the real democratic values of Israel, right? Not just a Jewish state, but as the Jewish democracy.
Right. Okay. In terms, first thing is that I'm not sure that in the present situation, here I'm actually giving a little bit of understanding to the government and to the right wing, even though I really do disagree with what they want to do. I don't think the courts are capable, I think they're capable in their own discussions and deliberations. As a matter of fact, not only are they capable, I know that they weigh the conflicting values that make it necessary for the courts to render. But I don't think it's the courts that can actually create the situation where everybody in the country, particularly people who are more vulnerable, will feel protected. I think a constitution is necessary for that. Because the thing here is that if you don't have a constitution, and when I talk about constitution, I have to tell you, because I deal with Jewish thought, I identify with the idea of Israel as a Jewish and democratic country, both in the full sense of the word. When I talk about a constitution, the need for to say that Israel needs a constitution, for me is the same thing in Jewish terms as saying that Israel needs a covenant. A different kind of covenant, but not absolutely different than the one that the Bible talks about at Sinai. There's this Rabbi Chaim Hershonson has a great take on that, as though the covenant wasn't really between God and the people until it was already established between the people and the people. It's like among themselves, according to the Bible, right? When they say we will hear and we will do, the we will hear means that the people agreed on a covenant. And part of the covenant they agreed upon, right? Part of the constitution was to make God's Torah their constitution. That's right. But I think in general, Israel needs a constitution because it needs a document that already expresses Israeli societies having worked through the different positions and the different conflicts, much in the way that the United States Constitution did through. It didn't give up principles in any way, but the way in which it compromised principles with each other was one of the most brilliant things in political history. Israel needs something like that. If the courts have a constitution that reflects that uniting tension, between the opposing viewpoints, then the courts can adjudicate and everybody will understand which part of the decision relates to which value. Without that, all we hear is the bottom line of the decision and everybody weighs it against what they wanted. And in this age of identity symbols, that's not the best thing for a stable country.
Can you talk more about the idea of the Constitution? I mean, we see now it's so hard to reach any sort of argument, right? The President Herzog tried to mitigate the judicial reform and got the cold shoulder from Netanyahu. So how do you see a constitution like that being formed? Would you be able to maybe point on a few main right ideas that this constitution will include?
Right.
Yep.
So the beginning of my answer to your question is to express all of my trepidations concerning the talks between the opposition and the government now under the president's auspices, which I think it's a great thing and I was all for it. Why do I have trepidations? Because I'm sure anything that the two sides agree to in the few weeks before the government threatens to resume the legislation, even if it's a good agreement, it's going to fall apart. Because you can't reach the kind of agreements and compromises Israel needs in a matter of a few weeks. You need a good half a year or more. We need to have discussions all over the country, right? And we need to have people debating, rather than saying, I'm for this and you're my enemy because you're for that, people actually debating and having. Herzog had one great idea. The politicians are never going to agree. Let me talk to the think tanks that impress them, but the politicians put a hold on it. As far as what you said concerning Netanyahu, because I do have to be fair, I think you're right. Netanyahu didn't want it, but what he said was, let's meet now. And the opposition said, there's no point in meeting unless you stop the legislation. And the government's answer was, so that's what you want, you just want to win. So we'll continue with the legislation. If you want to meet, let us know. Right, I think it was contrived in order, knowing that you can't reach an agreement, knowing that they might actually finish the legislation before the meeting, the agreement is reached. My opinion, therefore, is that I would like to see the president say to those people, keep talking, but on such and such a day or whatever, we're going to make a joint statement that we're going in a good direction but haven't gone far enough, and we're going to declare a constitutional convention, and also elaborate on the ways to get to that constitutional convention. Every community in Israel, and now I'm going more than the Jewish population, because the constitution is not a Jewish constitution. It's an Israeli civil constitution, which requires every group. But because the Jews are the vast majority of the country, we're talking in those terms. But everybody knows that's not sufficient. And I would really, really like to see the president declare a constitution and have all of society know, maybe it'll take even a year or two, but at the end, we'll actually be one society, one pluralistic society.
So I hate to rain on the parade, but Professor Dan Ben David was here last year. He was talking about his sort of outlooks to Israel in the future. There was a fascinating article about him, an interview with him in Haaretz this weekend. He's a numbers guy, and he's pulling these numbers from years. I think one of the most interesting facts that he brought is that by 2065, 50% of Israel population will be Haredim, and only 35 will be non-Haredi Jews. So he's looking at sort of 50% Haredi Orthodox, 15% Arabs. He says the Arab population will dwindle a little bit, and then 35. So my question is, do you think, how would a constitution then hold going towards this future, right? If we're just playing a numbers game, that's really just around the corner.
Okay, so first, do you know when that statistic was formed? Like when the polls were made, or when the research was done to make that? I don't. I remember by what I remember of Professor Ben David, as he keeps feeding the Excel sheets, and the numbers are always fresh. So okay. These are sort of outlooks that he has for numbers of years, okay. But he's always. The reason I asked is because I remember that statistic from a number of years ago, and I don't study these things.
It was
and I don't know who's right, and I understand also that it's. I hear from others that it's changed and it's been small.
and I mean it might.
Right, but the point is well taken.
If you think about perhaps more Haredi integrating into
whether
Israeli
it's 35% or 50%. I would put it like this. First of all, generally speaking, I'm not all that afraid of a large ultra-Orthodox population. I am afraid of a large ultra-Orthodox population in the current situation where there is no covenant. My own personal feelings, the generations of modern Jewry that I most identify with and appreciate are those that came from really conservative religious groups and formed there's this thing and formed a revolution. The original East European Hebrew Enlightenment was of that sort, right? People who came from very traditional pre-modern homes and developed a new way of Judaism, right? Zionism, especially the labor Zionism, we're out now, youth that just rebelled against its Orthodox surroundings. I see in Israel today, there's this term datlashim, right? Religious people People who were religious in the past and now don't consider them religious, these, by the way, are my favorite students. And I think to a large extent, the future of the country depends on them because they have the knowledge of Judaism and the identification, Judaism and being the Jewish people is a part of who they are, and they know sources, and yet they're part of the modern contemporary world with humanist, liberal, and sometimes socialist values. The bottom line of how I think it could work is that once we have a situation in which everybody understands what it means to be a Jewish and democratic state by agreement, almost everybody in every part of society will feel more freedom to move. Maybe not far from where they're starting out, but they'll be able to recognize certain affinities that they carry with them. They'll be able to recognize in another group what they would like to be and can't be in their group, as long as we're in a society where there is no covenant and more Israeli society has become differentiated groups that are insular unto themselves. I don't see it happening. In a healthy society, people change. There's dynamics, and I have no problem with that.
So I think I'll ask one more question, and then we can open for audience questions. Just kind of looking, we have Memorial Day coming, we have Independence Day coming. The ahidas should expire after these national holidays. I mean, what we see now is a country that's broken, right? Licking its wounds. The economy is staggering. Politicized military, which we never had before. Right. You talk about this constitution. What do you think, to the best of your prophetic abilities, what's going to happen in the next few weeks, in the next month, kind of going into summer? Are we going to see the same demonstration? Is there a grassroots campaign to start this constitution that you're talking about? What do you think?
So first of all, I'm enough of a scholar not to answer your question as asked. I can't know. Nobody can know. But we can see what the possible scenarios are. So one scenario will be that nothing comes of the present hiatus and the talks, and in a few weeks the government returns full force, and the demonstrations return full force, and we'll probably find a situation, I don't know if it's a matter of weeks, months, or a year, that the courts, by their conscience, won't be able to okay certain government laws, and the government will overturn the court's laws, and we'll find ourselves in a situation, like any country, the law enforcers are the army and the police. And if they don't do anything, nothing matters, right, in terms of putting the policy into position. And what will happen if we return to the same thing we were in before this hiatus, there'll come a time when the police and the army will have to decide whether they'll obey the government or obey the courts. My guess is at least the army will obey the courts. And I think the police too, but I'm not sure. That's the worst case scenario. But that means that we haven't solved the problem. It just, you will take a different direction. Another scenario will be, and this I don't think is going to happen, is that the opposition will have been so successful that the government's just going to give up on all its plans, and that's not going to happen. What we do see now, and that's a third scenario, is that, and this is an amazing thing to me, the opposition has, as successful as one could have wanted the opposition to be, it has been successful until this point. You mentioned, it didn't come into the conversation earlier, even without statements by the opposition, Israel's economy is beginning to falter. Investments are going down because people who invest want to know there's an independent court system that will get their money back if some corruption takes it away from them. But what's happened was that the surprising amount of not civil disobedience that actually happened, but the willingness to go on, that the things are so bad if these things go through in the opposition that we might not show. All of it's been volunteers, not people who are obligated to go to the army, that said, if they break the social contract with me and I'm volunteering, I'm not going to volunteer anymore. That's considered civil disobedience to an extent. The experience that Netanyahu recently went through in visiting foreign capitals and getting a cold shoulder, all of these things together, and I said again, including the surprise at how massive and powerful these demonstrations have been, made the situation, if it wasn't, and the thing that was most unbelievable, his firing of the defense minister, that nobody can understand or fathom, it's only inner politics, has brought the popularity of the government down as low as it could be imagined. Netanyahu, rather than thinking he was going to be secure in the government he put together, probably never felt as shaky as he does now. And that's the reason why he agreed to talks with stopping the legislation. There are reports I saw in the newspaper, in the Israeli papers today. Netanyahu apparently made a statement. There are debates what he actually said. Did he say he's going to go on with the legislation? Because he said, of course, that's our policy and we'll continue with it. But he also said nobody in my party or my partners really believe that the legislation is going to go through the way we originally planned. Is that intimating that he's backing down? I don't think there's going to be a radical backing down. I think politically that's impossible. And so I come to my final, right? That was another possibility. They're going to back down. They're not going to back down. But the reforms already, I hope I'm not wrong, because I don't want to mislead anybody, it already appears what they're going to try to push through will be much more moderate than was at this point. The final scenario is the one that I would like to see. These are all ways to get beyond the present immediate crisis. That's what those scenarios are. Israel will not be the kind of Jewish democratic state that the Jewish people want it to be without a constitution that represents the agreements made by a pluralistic Jewish world, of course, in Israel, but it's connected with the people of Israel, outside of Israel as well. Those are the scenarios I see. What's going to happen? I don't know any more than what I said. Those are the possibilities.
I need to know. I have travel plans somewhere. I need to know if to keep the airline tickets.
Right. But no. This is also the way I think that Netanyahu thinks. He doesn't know what's going to be. He has all of these scenarios, and he knows which one he prefers. He's waiting to see when he's going to have to make a decisive decision to see which one of these scenarios are best for him.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. That was fascinating. We're going to continue.
It hurts. Just know, thanks for the clapping, but it hurts.
Yeah.
Excuse me, if you have a question, give me a chance to run over to you with
Great.
the mic.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are many questions, and we have time.
I think this may be an opportunity, what's going on, and why doesn't the opposition call a no confidence vote and try to get this government to relinquish power, go to a new election, and I think the results will be very different.
So the first part of that, I agree entirely. For years, I think that not only is Israel in trouble, I think the world is in trouble. It's getting worse for a number of years now. And I remember speaking to friends and my brothers, my family and stuff. I always say, why don't people, I mean, it's in the United States, why don't people open their eyes, try to think, I'm talking about agreements, covenant, ward off the incredible crises down the road before they get here. And at the same time, I said, no, historically, there have been real changes made in the world, and every so often it's really for the good. It seems to me that people just don't have the motivation or realize the need until they're already in the crisis, and sometimes it can even be apocalyptic. And so I agree with you, though. That's why now there's a real opportunity. I've been thinking these things through for 30 years as I see the polarization developing, and now for the first time I'm not depressed. I've been depressed for 30 years because I can't see how this polarization is going to turn into something else. Now I can see because of the depth of the crisis. As far as why they don't call a no confidence vote, it's because the opposition knows it'll lose. The people who vote on the no confidence are all the ministers in the parliament of the Knesset today, where the government has a clear majority. That's what needs to be found out. At the moment the opposition thinks the way you do and assesses it the way you do, they'll call it a no confidence vote. But not now, they can't now.
I recently read an article in the Times of Israel about the lack of the Constitution in 1948 being formed. They developed what they called basic laws. Could you explain what that is and how they're being used?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not that much to explain. At one time, there may have been. The idea of a basic law was, first of all, there's an incredible discussion as to why Israel doesn't have a constitution, and that requires not a scholar of thought and philosophy, Jewish thought and philosophy, but a political scientist to try to explain who it is or why Israel didn't want a constitution and why Israel doesn't have a constitution. In lieu of a constitution, I don't even know when it started, but there became this process that will develop a constitution over time. So first they developed the basic law of the government that defined the structure of the government and the courts and everything else. And then one of the later basic laws was the basic law that turned the right in the country against the courts. Because one of the later laws in the 1990s was, I don't know the terminology enough. I guess you need a legal scholar here. But there was a basic law that prevented people from discriminating in employment and so on and so forth, and used the words of guaranteeing the dignity and I forget what other words is used, but having the equality, of human beings, in the workplace, etc. The courts understood that to be the first basis, that legal basis it actually had to perform real judicial review. Because now, if we're going to talk about protecting minorities, or if we're going to talk about protecting people whose sexuality is under attack from, a part of the country, right? Now the courts can cite that law as a basic law in order to explain why they decided for the protection of that individual, of that group, and not, the people who are persecuting them, let's say. Before that, all they have is their own logic and their own reason. The right wing in the country still says that, is basically saying that the basic laws are not is not a constitution, and the courts are still only using their own values. The most important thing to know is that even that basic law, which I appreciated, that guarantees equality in all areas of Israeli life, was not adopted by any clear majority that would distinguish it as a basic law from other laws. And now part of the government's initiative is to be able to formulate and legislate basic laws, which is the only thing close to a constitution that Israel has, with a 51% majority, right? So I actually forget now what the question was, but you asked me to explain what the basic laws were. So the basic laws are different laws that were developed because Israel does not have a constitution, and the really funny thing about it is that they were never enacted in such a way that could make an agreement as to how much of a constitutional basis this laws ever really give the courts, because if every law you can pass on a 51% majority like this one, it's not much of a covenant.
Hi. I was wondering if you could possibly regionalize this. We're in an environment where Saudi Arabia and Iran are in a rapprochement under China's guidance somehow. So what are the implications of inaction or any of the various actions that you say could possibly play out?
I don't know. This is an area that it's new now because of the drawing close of Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's clear that this flies in the face of everything that the previous Netanyahu government was interested in, because there's a move beginning with the United Arab Emirates to form relations and even coalitions between Israel and other Arab countries in the Gulf. And this is obviously, when that was presented as being so rosy, it doesn't look that rosy now with Saudi Arabia getting close to Iran. The only relevance that it's really relevant, but in terms of my own field of expertise, or my own abilities to understand how these two might be connected, I think that more than anything else, Israel has lost the power of its standing in the Mideast. If until this year, people were talking about the destruction of Israel. I'm talking about Israel's enemies, talking about the destruction of Israel in another 30 years or 50 years. Apparently, in the Mideast at the present, there are thoughts that it can happen now because of Israel's internal situation. All you need is a little push. And I don't know, but it could be that Saudi Arabia is getting close with Iran, has to do, when it was possible, then that would be the next peace agreement with Israel. It may have to do with Saudi Arabia thinking that Israel isn't what Saudi Arabia thought Israel was until now.
Okay. I think most of us grew up hearing about the army in Israel as the great equalizer, taking people from all different parts of society. And I think less is known about the educational systems, plural, maybe as the antithesis of that. And maybe could you provide a little background to that before...
If you give me a little bit more focus, because there are so many things I can say about the educational system.
For starters, just to explain all the different streams, because I don't think, and then my is what giving us all that background. What hope do you see as long as education is that insular and separated?
Yeah, well, so first let me get to the bottom, to the end first. In the kind of constitution that I envision, I think that part of it it can't determine, of course, educational policy. But I would like to see a constitution that does say something in terms of the purpose of education in Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And if that were to be done in a constitution, then you already have legal grounds for demanding and I'll say something about the different it's really educational systems in Israel, and I'll say something about that. But if you have that as a principle, a constitutional principle in the definition of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, then you can make demands of all the educational systems in Israel to honor that, what I see as that unifying principle. But the thing that needs to be taken into account, and this is why your question is so important, is that in Israel today there are different streams of education. There's national and religious education. There's the independent, ultra-Orthodox system of education. There's the national secular education, and there are the state or national schools in the in the Palestinian Arab population in Israel. And so each one of what's going on in the education of each one of these structures is pretty much a reflection of what I was mentioning before. Every educational system takes out of the idea of Israel as a state. And their understanding, if I'm talking about all of the Jewish groups, their understanding of the Jewish people, and that's what they teach in their school. So it's not that in the national religious schools they won't mention the principle of equality before the law. They will, but you won't get nearly as much of that as you do concerning the importance of the presence of Jewish tradition in the public sphere, as for an example. So you use the word insular. And so I think, once again, it's really important to have a legal demand for Israel to be one country. And anybody in their mind, there were a couple people who said, well, let Israel divide itself into 6 different countries. It's just an absurd idea, especially when you have security problems, right? And so I think it's necessary for the state to make demands of the educational system. This is a state, it's a sovereign state that's supported by the covenant made by the people of Israel. And if you want to be a part of this country, you have to teach, I think, Jewish sources, even in the secular schools. Don't have them taught by people coming from Orthodox society, have them taught by secular people, secular humanists. And the same thing in terms of education. You want to live in this country and have rights as a citizen of this country, then you have to teach and educate to the character of the state as Jewish and democratic. I would say the same thing, by the way, the same thing with army service. The matter of the present reality cries inequality. I understand why it's difficult for ultra-Orthodox to go to the army. I would love to see in Israel that the military service bill be changed to include national service, and there's an option both for the Arab population and the ultra-Orthodox population. There are good reasons why they maybe shouldn't be forced into the military, but for half the country to have to give service to the country and the other half to be, these are part of the reasons why I think it's so important for Israel to have a constitution. They have to reach agreements that become a covenant.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more because we have a wonderful reception waiting for us. Elliot, did you have one?
Quick question. You'd mentioned that some people thought that Israel had 30 years before there was going to be a problem.
I'm talking about Israel's enemies.
Right. Israel had 30 years, and now maybe it's 1 year. I'm just wondering if the perception is that because of perhaps the perceived weakness of the United States' position regarding Israel at the current time.
Maybe. I don't have enough of a sense of that to say that I'm sure that that's so. Yeah, I think it really has to do with the countries surrounding Israel, going as far as the Tigris and the Euphrates, have gone through various images of Israel, most of which were totally unrealistic, and I think that. And there was developed this after the image of Israel after this 1967 war as unbeatable, and I spoke to people who from the Gulf states. They imagined Israel like out of like a superhero comic book after the '67 war. That's obviously changed, but I think that the feeling, and they thought back then that means in order to make things right and get rid of Israel is going to take a really, really long time. I don't think that the present attitude toward Israel, thinking that Israel's on its last legs and collapsing at the present, well, I understand why they're thinking that way. I don't think it's any more realistic than it was thinking that Israel was a race of superheroes after 1967. It's a lot of inner thought, their own needs going into it.
And we have one more.
So last week, there was an interview with Naftali Bennett on NPR. Did you see it?
No, I may have, and I don't remember at the moment. I did see something with the news with a quote from him that he was talking. I don't remember. I didn't see an entire interview, that's for sure.
So I listened to it and I was very surprised. He said essentially that democracy has won in Israel already, and that was a few days ago that he said it. So he spoke about other things too, but that was the main message. First, do you agree? And second, why do you think he said it?
Why do I think he said that? Okay, so no, I don't agree. I think that democracy is really in danger. It's trying to be whittled down. The biggest threat, the most immediate threat, is the law of inequality that will do away with all the attempts to have equality in terms of national service. Why do I think he said it? I think it's because he's a politician.
Well,
And
he's no longer a practicing politician in Israel.
he'll re-enter very soon.
I don't think so.
You don't think so? No. Okay. That's not my impression, but that could be. But I think that's what it is. I think that there are things I appreciate about Bennett. There are things I don't so much appreciate. One of the things I think that always has to be taken into account was that politically, he was in Netanyahu's camp. He was one of those who actually spoke against the Supreme Court. And I don't think he meant it. I think it was to get votes. But there was a political advertisement before the previous elections in which it said that Bennett will, Bennett will win, or minatseach in Hebrew, will beat our enemies, will win against our enemies, and Schechter, who is, the other main member of Bennett's party, the word again, linatseach in Hebrew, the courts. But when you say linatseach, the courts, literally, they were very careful. They didn't mean that Schechter was going to beat the courts. They wanted people to know that they're on the side that wants to beat the courts. But it said, will linatseach, conduct the courts, like a conductor in an orchestra.
Oh, I see.
Right? So politically, there's no reason, there is reason for Bennett to be against the present government, including the courts, because he's not really nearly as radical as the right wing of the present government, and he wasn't for the present legislation, but he was going in this direction. But the other thing to remember about Bennett is that he was a chief aide and advisor to Netanyahu, and so was Schechter, who was the other main person in his party, and they left Netanyahu, or actually I think they were removed from Netanyahu because they say his wife was involved. There are all these stories, I don't even know what to do with them. But it's clear that he and Schechter really resented it. They ran independently and then joined what was the previous government, right? And it seems because they knew that the Netanyahu family has real animosity toward them, and they return the animosity toward the Netanyahu family. And so, in general, I don't really know how to interpret Bennett's statements. I know that they come both from ideological positions and from their personal experience in politics with the present politicians, Netanyahu and his government.
Well, I would like to thank everyone for coming. I would like to thank B'nai Israel for hosting, Phil for making everything look good and sound good, Rachel for organizing, Audrey and John for their generous sponsorship, Roy for moderating, and Yossi, that was wonderful.
Oh, thank you
very much.
Thank you. I have one more very important thing, or two very important things. One is to thank you. And I want you to know how, I'm trained to do this, like of being kind of tame. I don't know if you know how much I'm burning inside, how much this is ripping me apart and has been all year. The second thing is, if it's okay with everybody, I have a couple, two good friends here visiting me, and my friend Chaya needs to say Kaddish. So is it okay, right? Is that what we're?
Yeah, we can end things and whoever will.
Okay. Right, so if we have 10 people staying, then Chaya can say Kaddish, and it's all up to you. Again, thank you very, very much. And even though some of you I've met earlier this year, right, some of you not, all told, thank you. I had a great year here in Gainesville. Norm, thanks for everything. And B'nai Israel, thank you, and all of you for being Gainesville and accepting me so well. Thank you.